Hi, we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Andrew Potts, and I'm here on behalf of Preserving Legacies, which is a project of the National Geographic Society that supports locally led adaptation for heritage places around the world. The session we're kicking off right now is called Unlocking the Power of the Culture, Heritage, and Knowledge Provisions of the Global Goal on Adaptation. So the Global Goal on Adaptation, adopted last year, includes culture and heritage in a way that was unprecedented. It's a breakthrough moment in efforts to mainstream culture and heritage into international climate policy. Today, we'll give a little bit of background on what those provisions are, but we're mostly going to focus on plans for how to take that forward, how to leverage those provisions to the maximum benefit of supporting local communities and scaling up and out adaptation work for culture and heritage around the world. Also, the Global Goal on Adaptation decision text is very much being actively negotiated today and tomorrow. And so we'll try to give a bit of a report from the front lines on the GGA negotiations happening currently. To begin with, I want to thank our sponsors. This event is, as I said, sponsored by my organization, Preserving Legacies, and the Heritage Adapts to Climate Alliance, which is a joint project of Preserving Legacies and the Climate Heritage Network. You'll hear about that in a moment. It's also sponsored by the International Council on Monuments and Sites, ICOMOS, the American Anthropological Association, the International Federation of Library Associations, Architecture 2030, and the Petra National Trust, with some funding very generously provided by the Alif Foundation. So thank you to all the sponsors and funders for today's event. To begin with, I'm going to give you a 3-minute primer on the culture and heritage provisions of the Global Goal on Adaptation. I'm going to do this very quickly and at a high level, but don't worry. For some of you, this will be things you already know very well. For others, you're hearing it for the first time. Don't worry, we're going to be talking about these concepts for the next 90 minutes. I just wanted to give a brief frame of reference, so we're all kind of discussing this in the same space. The first thing is the Global Goal on Adaptation itself, the GGA. The Global Goal on Adaptation is one sentence. The whole thing is one sentence that was included in the Paris Agreement in 2015. It says that governments will work to enhance the world's adaptive capacity, strengthen resilience, and reduce vulnerability to climate change. So that's it, 2015. That was 9 years ago. But for those intervening 9 years, not a lot of action happened with the GGA until COP26 in 2021, when efforts to achieve more parity between the treatment of adaptation and the treatment of mitigation in international climate policy really took off. And at COP26 was started a multi-year process to flesh out the Global Goal on Adaptation that led to the adoption at COP28 last year in Dubai of the first ever framework for taking the GGA forward. This document is often called the Global Goal on Adaptation Framework, but it has a proper name, the UAE Framework for Global Climate Resilience. And the framework really provides a structure to guide national governments and other parties in enhancing their ambition and action on adaptation. One of the core elements of the framework is a set of 7 thematic targets. So the framework encourages national governments to enhance action and ambition around 7 themes. Some of these themes are ones you would expect to find, so enhance adaptation action for water systems, for food systems, for ecosystems. But the 7th thematic target is cultural heritage. So, as I said, this was really a breakthrough in the mainstreaming of culture and heritage into international climate policy. And by the way, it didn't happen by accident. It was a result of many years of work by many people. And so this thematic target on enhancing adaptation action for cultural heritage, known as paragraph 9G of the UAE framework, is one of the key things we'll be talking about today. Oops. Oh, I lost a slide. Okay, sorry. Sorry about that. Let me just tell you quickly what's in 9G, this seventh thematic target. It really has three parts. So one target on cultural heritage, but with three parts. It says governments should increase their work on developing adaptive strategies for heritage sites. One. It says governments should increase their work on developing adaptive strategies for cultural practices. Two. And the third part says governments should increase their work to guide the development of infrastructure with traditional knowledge and indigenous knowledge. So those are really three different elements of that one target. And together they make up 9G, the Global Goal and Adaptation Framework thematic target on cultural heritage. In addition to the 7 thematic targets, the Global Goal and Adaptation has 4 dimensional targets. These refer to the iterative adaptation cycle, which is the heart of national adaptation plans. It's really basically the idea that all adaptation, no matter what sector, what aspect, has kind of 4 phases. You start with risk assessment, then you do adaptation planning, then you do adaptation implementation, and then you do monitoring, evaluation, and learning of what you did already, and then you start over. So these are the 4 dimensional targets, 7 thematic targets, 4 dimensional targets, 11 targets in total. In addition to the targets, the back of the document, the back of the UAE framework, has a bunch of cross-cutting issues, and these are quite important. One of the cross-cutting issues is it says that adaptation in general should be guided by traditional knowledge, indigenous peoples' knowledge, and local knowledge systems. That's framework paragraph 14. Framework paragraph 22 says that adaptation action should be characterized by ethical and equitable engagement with indigenous peoples and local communities, and again, application of their knowledge, but also wisdom and values. I like that addition that's in paragraph 22. And then finally, paragraph 23 points out that it's important to the broader success of adaptation and climate action to pay attention to the knowledge, skills, values, and attitudes of the populace. So we really consider these cross-cutting issues of traditional knowledge, local knowledge systems, indigenous knowledge, values, wisdom, skills, attitudes, all are part and parcel with culture and heritage or culture adjacent. So we think these cross-cutting issues are very important. And so for the balance of the session, we're going to explore how the thematic target on cultural heritage and these 3 cross-cutting issues, how they can be manifested in the implementation of the Global Goal and Adaptation Framework, and how the implementation of the framework can ultimately benefit local communities and drive the scaling up and out of adaptation for culture and heritage. To kick off, so that's my brief overview of the GGA. I'm sorry, one last thing. In the framework, they decided to undertake a work program, a 2-year work program called the UAE BLEM Work Program on Indicators. So right now, we're in the middle of it. There are people meeting in this room today on this topic. This is a 2-year work program to develop indicators for measuring progress on each of the targets. So this would include, presumably, the development of indicators for measuring progress on the adaptation of heritage sites and cultural practices, for example. And this work program is supposed to conclude next year at COP30. The work program is an element of the framework. Okay, now, to take our conversation forward, it's my great pleasure to be able to introduce our keynote speaker. There are a number of people that are recognized leaders on climate action, of course. There are a number of people that are recognized leaders in culture and heritage, of course. But the pool of people who are recognized leaders on cultural heritage and climate action is not as big. And we are very lucky to have one of the foremost leaders and authorities on that field with us today. She's the president of the Petra National Trust. She's a UNESCO Goodwill Ambassador, and she's also the special envoy of the Climate Heritage Network to the high-level ministerial on culture-based climate action, which happened Friday here in Baku. It's my great pleasure to give the podium to Her Royal Highness Princess Dana Firas of Jordan.
Thank you, Andrew, very, very much. I apologize for my voice, but it seems that after 9 interventions, it's given out on the 10th. So that's my capacity for COPs from now on. So it is a privilege to be here today as we reflect on the global goal on adaptation and the vital role that cultural heritage now plays in our efforts to build climate resilience. This really is a momentous step forward in the climate adaptation agenda, and it is one that brings hope for a more inclusive and sustainable climate policy. I will speak a lot about why this is a great breakthrough, but please bear in mind that the work has only barely begun. We really are looking for a much wider integration of culture and heritage into climate policy. And this is one way where culture and heritage can make a huge difference. Climate and cultural heritage are deeply intertwined, and yet they are viewed often as separate areas. But where they intersect lies the space through which we safeguard people, places, the systems that sustain us, and the values that guide and inspire us. The preservation of our heritage in the face of climate change is not only a moral imperative, it is also a vital part of our collective effort to build a sustainable, resilient, and equitable future. The inclusion of cultural heritage in the global goal on adaptation, specifically under Target 9G, as Andrew just explained, is without question a groundbreaking development. So for the first time, we are recognizing that adaptation to climate change must go beyond physical infrastructures or economic resilience. It must also encompass the protection and preservation of our cultural heritage, which is at the heart of who we are as individuals, communities, and nations. Cultural heritage is not about monuments or historical sites only. It encompasses traditions, languages, practices, knowledge systems that have been passed down through generations. It is those cultural elements that shape our identity, our connections to one another, our relationship with the land, and our ability to adapt to a changing environment. And from the sacred landscapes of indigenous peoples to the ancient farming techniques that have sustained generations, cultural heritage offers a blueprint for resilience and one that has been tested and refined over centuries. And this heritage is under threat. Rising sea levels, desertification, flash floods, extreme weather events, and other impacts of climate change jeopardize both the tangible and intangible aspects of our cultural heritage. And these losses are not only environmental, they are deeply personal and cultural. Our heritage is intimately connected to our natural heritage, and both are in peril. And while the importance of safeguarding cultural heritage is widely recognized, its integration into national and international climate policy has been insufficient. This disconnect leaves cultural heritage vulnerable and under-resourced in the face of a rapidly changing climate. Target 9G is an overdue and necessary response to this challenge. Not enough, but important. The inclusion of cultural heritage within this policy framework recognizes the profound connection between cultural heritage and climate change. And by acknowledging the importance of cultural heritage in the GGA, we not only protect our past inheritance, but we enable communities to adapt to the future in a way that honors their knowledge and beliefs and strengthens their resilience. In particular, and Andrew went through this in detail, so I'll be very brief. In particular, the target acknowledges the need to safeguard both intangible cultural heritage, such as monuments, archaeological sites, and landscapes, and intangible cultural heritage, including traditional knowledge, rituals, art forms, and ways of life that have enabled communities to live sustainably within their environment. Both are impacted by climate change, and both are invaluable in the fight against climate change, as they offer solutions grounded in local wisdom and practices that have stood the test of time. Local knowledge and practices often hold the key to resilient responses to climate challenges. This target encourages the recognition and application of traditional knowledge systems and to begin to find real ways to enable communities to take an active role in designing and implementing their own adaptation solutions. And this is an issue of climate justice. Many of the communities that are stewards of cultural heritage sites are also among the most vulnerable to its effects and to the effects of climate change, and often lack the financial support, training, and capacity to respond effectively. Additionally, their traditional knowledge and practices play an important role in the fight against climate change, but remain undervalued and underutilized. And when cultural heritage sites are damaged or lost, it often undermines local economies, leaving them further exposed and vulnerable. To date, we simply have not placed adequate value on the loss of cultures, of ways of life, know-how, and place attachment that are inevitable in the face of rising sea levels and climate-induced migration. And Target 9G gives this knowledge the recognition it deserves and ensures that it becomes a cornerstone of our collective adaptation strategies. COP29 aims to mobilize unprecedented financing for climate change. And if COP succeeds in realizing the new collective quantifiable goal on finance and has a sub-goal on adaptation, Target 9G is the mechanism through which we can potentially unlock climate finance for cultural heritage protection. This funding is essential for the restoration and preservation of heritage sites, as well as the continued practice of traditional skills and learning that have contributed to the resilience of communities. But there is work to leverage this opportunity properly. That is where we have to focus. The process of operationalizing the GGA will require a collaborative effort of data gathering, aggregation, and standardized framework development that works internationally and across sectors, including government, civil society, international organizations, and local communities. And as metrics and indicators are developed, the voices of cultural practitioners and local communities must be included at all levels. And I want to mention here the launch of the Heritage Adapts to Climate Alliance, HACA, and I know Andrew's going, and JP will speak about it later. But it's a volunteer online community of practice that seeks to strengthen the inclusion of culture and heritage in international climate adaptation policies. And this is an important moment that we must seize. It presents opportunities to mobilize and scale up local action for climate adaptation. And through Target 9G, we reaffirm the importance of culture in the global conversation on climate change. We acknowledge that adaptation is not just about surviving. It is about thriving in a way that respects our past, embraces our traditions, and equips us for the future. By integrating cultural heritage in the global goal on adaptation, we are ensuring that solutions to climate change are as diverse and innovative and rich as the cultures of the world. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Your Highness, and I could not agree more with the points that you made. You've already heard from my short intervention and also from Princess Dana the importance across the GGA of indigenous knowledge and traditional knowledge, that these guide adaptation, planning, and implementation. It's been a long time coming, the recognition, this recognition of indigenous knowledge and its importance to climate action and the reflection of that in climate policy. And we want to take a moment to reflect on that importance and how we got to this moment where indigenous knowledge is so deeply valorized in the GGA. And to share some reflections on that topic, we're very, very lucky to have a truly preeminent leader in this field, Dr. Lucy Mulenkei. Lucy is the co-chair of the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity. She is a Maasai woman from Kenya. She is the executive director of the Indigenous Information Network and co-founder of the Indigenous Women in Biodiversity Network. And Lucy was also one of those leading these conversations at the Biodiversity COP at COP16 in Cali. And so, Lucy, how you made it through one COP and then came directly to Baku only to lead a second one is beyond me, but we're thankful for your stamina and grateful that you came here today to talk to us about the importance of guiding adaptation action with indigenous knowledge. Dr. Mulenkei, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and good afternoon, everyone. Your Highness, thank you so much for what you presented, because when you were doing it, I said, oh my God, she's finished all the presentation. Because what you touched is something very, very important. And for us indigenous people, she has explained everything. It's not just to look at adaptation and look at culture and climate and culture heritage and so on. It's more than what is there. It's our cultures, it's our traditions. Traditional knowledge to us is everything, is our identity. And if you look at the heritage, is what has been there for years and for centuries. And we value that. And that's where the history of the people is. And she clearly very much put it right there. And indeed, we came from Cali. Actually, we started from Bogota. Bogota, as indigenous people, we have an international indigenous forum on biodiversity. And these particular issues that are being discussed, and we also looked at some of the issues that you brought up, Andrew, at the beginning, and also Her Highness, what she brought up. And we wanted to make sure that we discuss further about traditional knowledge and try to look at some of the aspects to see how can we understand further and how can we be able to relate this and link this with traditional knowledge with other processes that we are doing. And our main target was to make sure that with the Convention on Biological Diversity, where it recognizes very well about the role of indigenous peoples and local communities under Article 8J and related provision, was very important to make sure that we can be able to look at this very clearly. And also like the cultural heritage and all these other aspects come actually under that provisions. And at the same time, we wanted by the time we go to Cali for the conference of parties, the parties also will have already had some ideas and some recommendations that can help us target and be able to get the goals that we wanted. We wanted to have a subsidiary body for Article 8J, for indigenous people and local community to enhance their participation, to enhance our participation and to be able to discuss these cultural issues very well. And as much as we are discussing here in climate, which is related very clearly, because we know climate change, all the Rio conferences actually, conventions are related. And it's very important to bring the synergies together. Because if we don't do that, we lose. We are losing biodiversity at the same time. We cannot be able to adapt and to be able to protect ourselves from climate change or even work on climate change. And I'm talking on that ground level where we have the communities down there, because that's where we begin and that's where we all came from. And that's how we have to build it as we move on to the upper area. So after doing that, we were able to bring up quite some recommendations. And then we came up to COP in Cali, and for 2 weeks, we discussed quite a lot of issues, and it was very, very important to ensure that we have a program of work that can be able to enhance the participation of indigenous peoples and local communities. And actually looking at this particular target and looking at the global goal that we are discussing about, it's really something that on adaptation is something that fits very well on our work. And before we started discussing, I told Andrew, this is very good and it has come at the right time so that when we start implementing working on our subsidiary body, this can be one of the most important subjects that we can pick up. As you have clearly said, we need also to create awareness, build capacity, and people to look at them in different ways and try to understand how these cultures, heritage, and the traditional knowledge are all related. And during the conference of parties in Cali, we were also able to have a summit on culture and nature summit, nature and culture summit, which also looked at the different heritage, and we were working with the different partners, UNESCO and other parties, and different key players of different issues on cultures and traditional knowledge. So also it brings up again to what Andrew was explaining and Her Highness, to say that all these are related. They are related and they move together. Because even if you go and look at the indigenous people, whatever they do is related to the other item. If they live in the forest, if they live in the grassland, if they live in the desert, it's all related. And it's very, very crucial. Even the soil and the sand that is in the desert is important to them because that's their heritage, that is their culture, that's their tradition, and they know what it is and it means. They can tell when the rain can rain, when there will be drought, and when they'll be able to have water and where they can have water and what to follow. They have wildlife and birds and everything is composed together. You know, the way God made biodiversity, it's all related. Anything that has life, plants, everything is related. So I think it's very important to ensure that we take this work forward. The adaptation and the target already, the 9G, is something that needs to be looked very keenly and be split up to be able to know exactly what are we talking about and how we can be able to relate it to other activities. During the Culture Summit, so that I don't take a lot of time, we were able to also document what we did out of the Bogota conference, the summit we did on traditional knowledge. And we saved everything on this particular whatever you call it there. So what I'll do is I'll give a highness one. We have a few that will be here left, and then we'll see who will be able to get. But if you're from one organization, you can take, and then later on you can go and look at it. We also have a QR. That's what I was told it's called. I'm from the old books. So you scan it, and then you go and check out there and see how it's going to help you in terms of looking at details. It's also going to provide you about the website of the biological of the forum, because we have quite a lot of issues that we discuss, and we have already planned to be able to work very clearly with the indigenous people in climate change, and that's why some of us are here, so that we can relate and we can be able to connect our work and see how we can put the synergies together and work together and make it a success in future. We were in Dubai. It was a wonderful place to be there, to have all those activities that were there. And it was good that this was already discussed, and it was something that was coming up very clearly. And we were looking at it behind it to make sure that it succeeds. And that's what we want to continue ahead, and to ask as many partners as possible to get together with indigenous people. We need indigenous people to be involved, not only by name, but let them be on the table like I'm sitting here. Let the money come directly to them so that they can be able to do the activities, and they can be able to do the planning and work with other partners, so that these partners can also be looking at them as partners in development, as partners who can develop policies together and put some of these critical issues together. So by the time we go to Belém, we will be having something that we can say, here we are, we come with the two hands that we've been working together for the past 1 year now, that is going to begin from now, today or tomorrow when we finish COP. Thank you very much, and I do wish you all a very good time here, and also good listening to this, and we are glad you are all here. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me thank our two keynote speakers again, but also invite them to step down if they if that's better for them. But please join me again in thanking Princess Anna and Dr. Mulenkei. You've heard, of course, now quite a bit about 9G, Target 9G. It's the thematic target on cultural heritage, but we really want to stress some of these cross-cutting issues that are identified in the Global Goal and Adaptation Framework: ethical and equitable engagement with local communities and indigenous peoples, guiding adaptation with traditional knowledge and indigenous knowledge, and attention to skills, values, and attitudes of the population. So our next panel is going to focus on those dimensions. And to moderate our panel, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Yasemin Kologlu. Yasemin is a recognized leader in building design, construction, and sustainability. She founded the Climate Action Group at SOM, a world-famous architecture firm. She's also on the board of the Consortium for Sustainable Urbanism, and she is a senior fellow at Architecture 2030, one of our valued partners in today's event. So Yasemin, if you would take us into our panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is a hard act to follow, following the two speakers that we had today. So as we continue to ramp up our climate adaptation efforts, we must encourage ethical and equitable engagement with indigenous peoples around the world and empower local communities. So today we will hear from our esteemed speakers about values and attitudes as cross-cutting issues in the iterative adaptation cycle. And without further ado, I would like to invite our first presenter, who is joining us remotely, Dr. Salma Sabour, Director of Science representing Preserving Legacies Project, and to talk about overview of the adaptation cycle. Dr. Sabour, floor is yours.
Thank you, Yasemin. I would like to share my screen if that's possible. Thank you. First, I would like to thank Her Highness Princess Diana for her speech, and also Dr. Lucy for her amazing talk about how we need to integrate what's happening at different COPs when talking about adaptation, because yes, there is no adaptation without integrating of nature in everything we are doing. And thanks, Andrew, for presenting so well the different thematic and dimensional targets of the GGA. Today, I wanted to kind of like go a little bit deeper on the importance and actually the critical importance of integrating local, indigenous, and scientific knowledge into the 4-dimensional targets of climate adaptation. And this integration is not only essential for effective adaptation, but it's also aligning very well with paragraph 22 of the GGA, which recognizes the leadership of indigenous peoples and local communities as stewards of nature and culture. When we see in the adaptation cycle, like in this graph, you can clearly see the 4 elements that are impact, vulnerability, and risk assessments, implementation, planning, and monitoring, evaluation, and learning. Traditionally, when we think about the adaptation cycle, this cycle has been dominated by a combination of scientific approaches, Western scientific approaches, funder-driven priorities, often influenced by political considerations. So international funders and development agencies played a significant role in shaping adaptation strategies, often prioritizing their own agendas and relying heavily on Western scientific knowledge. Today, we understand that this approach has overlooked and undervalued local and indigenous knowledge, systems, and communities, but also we have a better understanding that locally led approaches that incorporate plural knowledge systems are crucial across all 4 elements of the adaptation cycle. So, for example, if we think about the first element of the cycle, which is impact, vulnerability, and risk assessments, scientific data, frameworks, consistent ways of doing risk assessments, impacts, and vulnerability assessments are important and invaluable. But we also know today that indigenous knowledge and local knowledge provide insights into local ecosystems, weather patterns, historical changes that we can't grasp only with scientific knowledge. For example, if you think about mountain regions, indigenous communities often possesses deep ecological knowledge passed down through generations that could help identify subtle environmental shifts that scientific instruments can't measure. And this is where we can think about, we're reaching a wall with the scientific knowledge. We know enough with the scientific knowledge, and we need more integration of different knowledge systems. When you're thinking about the planning phase of adaptation, locally led approaches ensure that adaptation strategies are culturally appropriate and address community priorities and not funders' agendas. So indigenous knowledge and local knowledge systems include traditional farming techniques, for example, water management practices that have proven resilience to climate variability, and that needs to be present when we're talking about adaptation. So it's very important in the planning phase of adaptation to have an inclusion of communities in those plans to develop more effective and sustainable adaptation practices. In the implementation phase, which is actually the heart of the adaptation cycle, locally led approaches allow communities to take ownership of adaptation project processes. And this is not only increases the likelihood of success of the adaptation, but also builds long-term capacity collaboration within the communities. because climate change is also affecting social cohesion within communities. It's destructuring places that have been resilient for generations and generations. So it's also important to think about adaptation, not only to protect the system, but also to allow the system to build a new type of resilience. And within this, the implementation acknowledge the importance of incorporating different elements and knowledge systems at a local level. And finally, in the monitoring and evaluation stage, local and indigenous knowledge can provide nuanced understanding of project impacts. So how this adaptation project that we are implementing, how can we measure it? And can we have a various list of metrics, from standardized one to very specific ones, to ones linking to local knowledge, to ones linking to indigenous knowledge, and ones linking to scientific knowledge, and having a kind of like co-creative list of different metrics. Because we know clearly today that traditional ecological indicators, for example, can complement scientific data. And this is the only way to have a holistic view of adaptation outcomes. So it's very key, as you see in this graph, that we need to weave different knowledge systems, not only adding them to each other, but cross-pollinating them, connecting them in ways that we have never maybe thought about in the past, and to be really creative in the way we want this knowledge system to be as one. When we think about locally led, what do we mean? Locally led adaptation in the context of climate change refers to an approach that empowers frontline communities to advance solutions through equitable climate finance and decision-making processes, but also fostering synergies between local, indigenous, and scientific knowledge systems at a local level. So we don't want this integration to happen at an expert level, but to happen at the local level. So for indigenous people, for example, to be able to take the scientific knowledge themselves and integrate it with their own knowledge. And this approach recognizes that people and communities on the front lines of climate change, when equipped with diverse knowledge inputs, are the best placed to identify, develop, and implement effective adaptation solutions. And it means also that local communities and indigenous people are not just consulted, but are active decision makers and active actors in this process. It really involves recognizing and respecting diverse worldviews, knowledge systems, communities, and ensuring adaptation strategies are rooted in local context and values. We can think about locally led adaptation actors like community-based organizations, citizen groups, local governments, small businesses, indigenous peoples, vulnerable populations within the community, and that are kind of working with national governments, international funders, NGOs, and that we need to have this system of locally led, internationally or nationally funded, have a connection that really gives a lot of power at a local level. So as I said earlier, locally led approach aligns perfectly with the paragraph 22 of the GGA. This integration of knowledge system at a local level foster community cohesion and resilience. And it's crucial to note that this isn't only about extraction of local knowledge and indigenous knowledge. So it's really important to not extract. It's really about fostering true collaboration. And I really want to kind of like emphasize true collaboration is rare. It's something that we don't know today how to do it in a safe way and in a purposeful way. So we have lots of work to do on how to create true collaboration and true co-creation, and to acknowledge shared ownership of new knowledge. And this requires addressing power imbalances and ensuring that indigenous peoples and local communities have agency in the adaptation process. So to conclude, in the cycle, adaptation cycle, integration of local knowledge, indigenous knowledge, and scientific knowledge is important across all 4 steps of the adaptation cycle. It's not only beneficial, but it is essential for effective, sustainable climate adaptation. It's key to decolonizing adaptation processes, and it's the keystone for social and climate change justice. Coming back to what Princess Diana just said, this is really an issue of social justice and climate justice. It's also
Perfect.
about, thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Dr.
you.
Silva. Thank you for all your remarks, and particularly bring us the importance of not just scientific knowledge, but also weaving in local and indigenous knowledge in the adaptation process as well. So we would like to continue then with Dr. Crystal Felima, who is a professor of anthropology, representing today American Anthropological Association, talking about equitable, ethical engagement with local communities and indigenous peoples' cultural dimensions.
Hi, everyone. So I'll start with the UFGCR paragraphs 14 and 22 emphasizes ethical engagement with indigenous communities, local communities, and the application of traditional knowledge within the adaptation process. And if we consider this engagement, we are thinking about how our strategies in planning can be inclusive and responsive to the diverse needs and intersectional needs of local communities and indigenous peoples. In anthropology, we recognize the intentional and ethical methodologies and approaches that we use to engage with communities. We try to build relationships and connect with local community members to help us understand climate risk, disaster vulnerability. And we also value knowledge and collective experiences and local approaches and voices within our research. So we capture stories, we collect narratives, we try to understand people's experiences because we believe in privileging local insights. And that allows us to think through vulnerability, risk assessments within our research. And to the goal of climate ethnographers and disaster anthropologists, we hope that this work in storytelling narratives translate into the climate science and global climate strategies. Through my work, I work in Haiti, a country that deals with pervasive political issues and ecological crises and economic instability. And so through my work with emergency managers in Haiti, with local community members, there could be market women, the youth, et cetera. My goal is to help me understand experiences. How do people adapt? How does corruption or US policy impact the climate experience? And so I want to, as an anthropologist, share a story with you all about a woman who experienced flooding. And it's pervasive flooding in Haiti. It happens a lot. And so people are dealing with not only pervasive political instability, economic issues, but they also deal with ecological issues, their disruption to their cultural landscapes, to their religious sites, et cetera. And so this particular narrative that I'll share with you with a woman who experienced flooding, she's a 40-year-old market woman. She lives in a river community. This river community experiences flooding due to climate change and also some human-built factors that heighten climate vulnerability. And so from her transcript, this is her story. Quote, when flooding comes, we usually leave the area walking in the water. We go to a place where it's dry, where there's more security, like someplace beyond the bridge. If you can't stay at your neighbor's house, then you must go out to the streets. A canoe can take you from the area for $1, US dollar, for each person. Everything overwhelms you. You can't stay. Some people go to the church nearby. If the water is high outside, then it's high inside your house. So you must close the door so that the animals and trash don't enter the house. Me, I don't leave. I don't leave to go to any school or church. I stay here. These schools and churches can't support us all with food and toilets. If flooding comes here and you don't have any money, you just stay as is. And if you go to the church or school, you don't have anything to eat because you may not have any money. So I just stay here. And if flooding comes and you don't have any money, I also may stay hungry. You also can't eat. It's all according to your pockets. Some people just stay because the flooding is an opportunity for thieves to come to profit. They come in canoes and they can steal your stuff whenever they want to. And also in this narrative, she talks about her health risk. She also says that hunger kills her. She doesn't have any food to make. They don't have anything in the house. So all the things are ruined due to flooding. She lost clothes, bed, TV, radio, everything. She also said that her children didn't have birth certificates because they were lost in the water. All of her merchandise as a market woman was ruined. And also, what was interesting, she talked about her family, and so kids couldn't go to school. And if they did go to school, she would have to she would have to carry her children through the mud. She also talked about her health concerns, having bacterial infection due to diarrhea and vomiting, and also having an 8-day stay in a local hospital due to cholera. And so she talked about her experiences, and I think that as anthropologists, we're interested in the realities of climate crises and disasters and what the bodily, physical, and social impacts of people and their families experience. And her words helps us think about the threats of disasters and climate change to local communities and their local cultural landscapes. And we center stories and narratives of vulnerability and risk within our analysis and our assessment so that we can understand these intersectional factors. It could be of nationality, gender, disability, ability, sexuality, immigration status. All these social identities help us think through vulnerability assessments and risk assessments. And the key to that is that the adaptation process has to be culturally specific and localized based on a culture or indigenous community. And so with an ethically engaged process that involves communities, their rights, their values, their needs, all of that should be at the forefront. And as anthropologists and other people in this room, our goal is to work with communities. We build relationships, we connect, we ensure that there's collaboration, cooperation throughout the process. And most importantly, we think about reciprocity, right? As the previous speaker said that, sometimes we can be parasitic where we take, but what do we, how do we think about reciprocity within our work and with our outreach? And so that participatory approach through the adaptation process must build trust. We must think about collaboration for sustainable long-term adaptation. And if you're a researcher, right, we're thinking about the different ways we engage communities. That could be through community participatory approaches. It could be through community mapping, collecting oral histories, thinking about mobilization, et cetera. But overall, the goal of an ethically engaged process is to think about inclusive participation, respect for knowledge and agency, equity, justice, trust, the reduction of harm as we work with communities through global climate action. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Felima. I think you highlight the importance of engagement, but also reciprocity within this adaptation process, which are the two aspects that we have to work very closely as we move our adaptation efforts forward. And finally, I would like to invite Claire McGuire, Policy and Advocacy Manager, representing International Federation of Library Associations and Institutions, and to talk about the role of culture and heritage in building the values, attitudes necessary for climate action. Claire.
Thank you so much. I think this is a great moment to pick up on that participation moment. So yes, I'm focusing on the values and attitudes necessary for climate action. And I think we need to keep in mind that adaptation is systems change. It's certainly true in the transformational adaptation, but it's valid in every modality. And systems change requires participation, buy-in and empowerment at all levels, but especially the local and the community level. And we can look at different behavioral change models, but most refer to capability. Do people have the knowledge and skills to participate in the change? Do they have the opportunity to participate? And do they have the motivation? And that's really where I see culture and education at all levels intersecting with the GGA across the GGA ambitions. Building the necessary values and attitudes that enable systems change is a culture issue. It's a lifelong learning issue, and it's a public participation issue. The framework does recognize this cross-cutting issue. And as we're talking about unlocking the power of culture, heritage, and knowledge, provisions of the GGA, I will focus on this culture education intersection in two ways. Firstly, within the culture and heritage target area, PACA has a strong focus on supporting locally led adaptation efforts, but I think we need to also stress the lifelong learning potential held within our culture and heritage. The framework stresses preserving our practices, our heritage sites, but to unlock co-benefits of community-wide value and attitude change, cultural and non-formal educational institutions and spaces can be seen as partners, especially in terms of outreach, of education and participation, from interpretation centers at museums and sites to libraries. These are spaces where the capability, the opportunity, and the motivation for behavior change can occur, increasing the interaction between culture and cultural practices and the community at large. Secondly, culture, I want to look at the culture education link as a transversal enabler of the GGA across the framework's target areas. Culture-based approaches enable individuals to understand complex issues through values, traditions, and norms of the societies where they live. Adaptation across every target area requires this understanding, and that is achieved through participation. It's achieved through exchange, storytelling, and learning. So we do see this in the technical paper on defining and understanding transformational adaptation produced by the Secretariat. There's an example in agriculture of farmers moving to be land stewards, to rely on local knowledge, and this can't happen without a culturally appropriate approach. And this requires knowledge exchange and learning. So what if we could use our public spaces like libraries to enable farmers to learn new skills, to be equipped with ICT experience to help them be involved in farmer-to-farmer knowledge sharing? This is an example we've seen, and this is an example that can be applied more broadly. And in cases where the whole community must change, must adapt fundamentally, we're talking about reshaping the cultural and the social connections. And cultural spaces, our community spaces, our practices, our heritage, this is at the heart of that. And we cannot neglect the cultural aspect of this change really across all the target areas. So I'll end with my calls to action. First, to fully grow the values and attitudes needed for climate action. The focus on education as a transversal enabler of the GGA must be lifelong and community-wide. Implementation strategies, corresponding indicators must recognize that learning happens within the classroom and also within the community and within our heritage spaces, within our non-formal education and cultural institutions. Secondly, we must unlock opportunities for education and participation that our culture and our heritage enable. We must reach outside the culture sector and create the opportunity for all different types of people to encounter, to engage, and to share their culture and their interpretation and their experience. And you can use this to empower this society-wide transformational change. So storytelling, outreach, and participation, these are critical. And finally, and perhaps most critically, we need both of these actions to be visible, to be implementable, and to be measurable through national adaptation plans, policy instruments, planning processes, and strategies. And we must measure this in a holistic way through appropriate indicators that capture the transformative power of culture, heritage, community participation, and lifelong learning. So I'll end there, but thank you.
And thank you. I would like to thank all of our speakers today. And I think it's an important point to remember that this effort is all about people. The anecdotes that you all provided today is really meaningful. It reminds us the importance of weaving local, indigenous, and scientific knowledge together. But also it also reminds us that we need to provide opportunities, abilities, and reciprocity in this climate adaptation process. Thank you again. Very much appreciated.
Great. I'll invite our panel to step down, and we'll give them another round of applause while they do. And meanwhile, I'll ask Dr. Luckson to join the dais. So these cross-cutting issues you just heard about are included in the GGA framework in the back, but they are not embedded in the targets per se. So a challenge we have in front of us is to make sure that these issues are deeply taken on board in the implementation of the targets themselves. Okay. if I could ask the technicians to bring in our two online speakers, Dr. Cartalis and Dr. Nalau. I mentioned very briefly at the outset that the UAE framework includes a work program on indicators. It's called the UAE BALEM Work Program on Adaptation Indicators. And this work program is trying to develop indicators to measure progress on the various targets, including the 4-dimensional targets and the 7 thematic targets, including the cultural heritage target. This program is being undertaken by the UNFCCC subsidiary bodies, and those bodies took the decision to bring together experts to advise them on the process. And that included selecting experts on each of the thematic targets as well as the dimensional targets. And we're now going to go into a discussion of the progress of the work program, the work on developing indicators to measure progress on cultural heritage, the work to include some of these cross-cutting issues in the targets being developed on in the indicators being developed on the dimensional targets. And to do that, we are very, very lucky to have with us 3 of the experts that were selected by the subsidiary bodies to guide them on this process. We have with us in the room, Dr. Luckson Zvobgo. Luckson is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Africa Climate and Development Initiative at the University of Cape Town, where he focuses on the global goal on adaptation. He's also advising the Africa Group negotiators here at this COP on the GGA. Luckson was also a chapter scientist and contributing author of the IPCC's 6th Assessment Working Group 2 Regional Africa chapter. And so Luckson, thank you for being with us. And then Luckson is one of the 7 experts selected by the subsidiary bodies in the cultural heritage thematic of the UAE BALEM work program. We also have a second of those 7 experts with us online, Dr. Johanna Nalau. Dr. Nalau is with Griffith University and the World Adaptation Science Program. She also was just with us here at the COP and then flew home to Australia. So, Johanna, you're looking very fresh for someone who's just been around the world. Johanna is an adaptation scientist with a PhD in climate change adaptation. Her research focuses on understanding how, why, and when people make decisions to adapt to climate change. She was also a lead author of the IPCC 6th Assessment Report, Working Group 2, the chapter on small islands, and also the summary for policymakers. And then last but not least, we have with us Dr. Constantinos Cartalis. Dr. Cartalis is a professor of environmental and climate physics and director of the Laboratory of Environmental Physics and Meteorology at the National and Cappadocian University of Athens. And Dr. Cartalis is one of the experts that was selected under the dimensional targets. So remember, risk assessment, adaptation, implementation, planning, and monitoring, selected as an expert on the dimensional targets. But Dr. Cartalis's research focuses on vulnerability of cities, tourism, forests, natural history, and the impacts of climate change on cultural heritage. So he's sort of a cultural heritage expert in one of the other verticals of the GGA. And so it brings a different but very complementary perspective. So thank you, Constantinos, Johanna, and Luckson for being with us today. We're running a little late, so I'm going to combine a couple of the questions that we identified for ourselves for this moment. And I'm going to ask our panelists first, why this project of setting indicators is so important, and what potential does it have for the broader goal of scaling culture-based climate action? These experts have given a lot of time and energy in very compressed timelines to this process. Why? Why do you see this exercise of setting indicators under the thematic and dimensional targets to be so important, and what is its value? Luckson, since we have the pleasure of having you with us here in the room, could I ask you to start?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew, and it's an honor to be amongst you to share some of these insights from the discussions or from the progress that is going on and on the work that we are doing as experts supporting the UNFCCC and the SB chairs. on the development of the GGA indicators and specifically for the cultural heritage indicators. And like Andrew said, it's very important, and for the first time, and I think the first speaker also highlighted this. This is the first time we had cultural heritage elevated at a global climate policy. So this was more like a groundbreaking moment for the cultural heritage society. And I'm going to touch on the question that Andrew asked. If you look at, for example, it's one of the graphic example where you can see why having targets and indicators for cultural heritage is so important. If you look at the Green Climate Fund, or if you look at any other UN climate funding mechanisms, you understand what I'm saying. They use sectorial approach to fund climate adaptation projects. For example, there is a portfolio for water, there's a portfolio for agriculture and food, there's a portfolio for biodiversity, but there's no specific portfolio for cultural heritage. One of the reasons is because we don't have in the past a specific ambition that focuses on cultural heritage. So having indicators and a target, a whole target on cultural heritage is going to sort of elevate the ambition towards climate adaptation in the context of cultural heritage. And also, so it's one of the graphic examples where you can see why having a target and why having indicators that specifically track the progress of adaptation, specifically for the cultural heritage, is so important. And it's one of the things that we have been trying to advocate in my capacity, providing technical support to Africa Group of Negotiators and also to the wider G77 and China groups to say we definitely need means of implementation indicators in this discussion. And it's one of the reasons, because when you have your means of implementation indicator that is going to also incorporate the cultural heritage, you have a chance to sort of now have in these UN multilateral funding mechanisms to have a portfolio that is going to specifically focus on cultural heritage as a sector. So I think this is an opportunity to really take this, to take the momentum with the indicators in development. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And Luckson's already raised one of the hot button issues in the negotiations about the GGA at this COP, which is means of implementation like finance, and whether or not that will play a part in the indicator package. So thank you for that preview, and we'll come back to that at the end of the session. Let's go to Australia, Dr. Nalau, and same question.
Thanks. And yes, I'm very tired, but still functioning.
You don't show it.
Yeah, look, I think it's a massive opportunity. I think adaptation overall has been sidelined in the negotiations for a long time, and now we have the global goal on adaptation, and so the actual indicator work will be really critical to show what type of progress we are making across all the thematic indicators, but specifically for cultural heritage, as you said there, and then as Luckson was saying, there has been a really big push to have something like this included in the negotiations. And I think it's really critical that we have the indicators specifically for this thematic target to understand how we're tracking, for instance, with cultural heritage. But I think the previous speakers also highlighted the complexity with having cultural heritage indicators that would be representative of global progress. How do you make indicators, for instance, for somebody's experience or, like spiritual experience that is included in their cultural heritage? So I think we have quite a big challenge ahead as well. But it's definitely critical to have indigenous knowledge in particular represented much better than we have been able to do before. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And then finally, Constantinos, I think you're in Greece now, home in Greece, am I right? So thank you for joining us. He's gonna as well. But same question, what do you see as the promise of this work on indicators for the dimensional targets? And maybe if you have a thought on a second question, have you seen any potential to incorporate some of these cross-cutting concerns into the thinking about the dimensional targets? Please, Constantinos.
Okay. Well, thank you, Andreas, and thank you for the invitation. And I will start by the fact that this whole process about the indicators was very useful because we have sorted out the fact that we need composite indicators instead of primitive ones. For instance, there were numerous numbers of indicators speaking about the increase of temperature, the decrease of precipitation, the number of heat waves. We have decided in the group that these do not reflect a composite indicator. They do not reflect the progress towards adaptation. They are just elements of parts of 10A, 10B, 10C, or 10D, for instance, a warning system or a climate service. So that was important because it clears out the understanding of what an indicator is all about. The indicator needs to reflect progress and at the same time to recognize gaps and weaknesses. And also it needs to also have the potential to link in between different sectors. And I will give you an example which was not obvious, at least in the working group that I was working in. For instance, when you designate a natural heritage site, you need to also take into consideration the integrity, the continuity, and the density of the cultural heritage. This has to be reflected in an indicator. And this indicator, if it's been constructed as such, gives you a good opportunity to link cultural and natural heritage. In another case, when you are doing an adaptation plan, you need to exhaust the movable concept. That is to exhaust adaptation plans and adaptation actions on spot in order to avoid the danger to remove a monument from one place to the other, and at the same time to lose cultural memory. And in this case, the indicator has to again be in a sense that links these different aspects. An adaptation plan, but at the same time to evaluate whether the adaptation plan has that structure that promotes adaptation on spot in order to respect the immovable concept. So we have concluded that we need to do more work with respect to putting together more elements in indicator so that the indicator will have the capacity to demonstrate more things than a simple information. And this brought us to another issue with respect to global and local indicators. Of course, the progress has to be towards global indicators. But when you speak about cultural heritage and when you want to introduce in the story the local knowledge, the traditional knowledge, the local practices, the local knowledge systems, you have to also dip into local indicators because they are so different from one place of the planet to the other. So there's no one recipe for all. You have to accommodate the indicators in order to take note of the needs and also to take very much attention with respect to the data. I have a strong reservation with respect to the capacity to perform the indicators exercise in the future, taking that a lot of data is missing. So we have to also educate the different member states on what kind of data they need to collect for these specific cultural heritage indicators, or the indicators that link, for instance, natural to cultural heritage, at what scale, at what frequency, what exactly they have to collect in order to be able to finally develop the indicators.
Great, thank you, Constantinos. Let me direct this next question to Luckson and Johanna. The experts, the idea of having the experts was only decided at the subsidiary body meetings in Bonn in June of this past year. And already you came to Baku only a few months later with a fair amount of work done. Can you update the audience on the work that the cultural heritage experts did in between being selected only a few months ago and getting here to Baku? So you did some mapping and other evaluation. Can you describe that a bit?
Thank you. Johanna, do you want to come in or I go in first? So, I know you're quite handy with the statistics and all that we had in the cultural heritage group.
Okay. Yeah. So I can just give a very brief explanation. So the 5,000 were submitted. The cultural heritage actually didn't get that many indicators compared to, for instance, the dimensional targets. So our final number was 232. So that was after removing duplicates. So the Secretariat basically asked every target group. So they identified what indicators belong to what theme. And so we received an Excel sheet, and like you said, the process has been quite difficult with such a short time frame. So the first, we were told to have 12 different types of criteria for each indicator. A lot of the submissions from the countries and that we received didn't have enough information on those. So then in the end, it was decided just to think about the relevance to adaptation overall, and then relevance to the actual thematic target and how that's worded. And our cultural heritage target has quite many different components. And a lot of the indicators were also related to some were from SDGs and some were from Sendai, but we also recognized really the need to also develop new indicators specific to cultural heritage, because we agree that some of the dimensions or aspects of cultural heritage are not necessarily captured well at the moment across the indicators that we received. So we had lots of submissions, for instance, on planning, so whether there has been plans for cultural heritage adaptation, so that would be more of a numeric target across the globe. But then we also had indicators that would imply, for instance, loss and damage. So how climate impacts are already impacting cultural heritage across the world. And obviously even the term cultural heritage is very broad. And there were also specific indicators requested for indigenous knowledge, cultural practices. So for now, we've gone through all of the 232. So we divided them across the experts. So we each looked at and also provided a specific explanation for each indicator, why we have chosen yes, no, or maybe. So a lot of the indicators are not necessarily adaptation, or they can be adaptation, but not necessarily cultural heritage relevant. So the maybe column in particular has indicators where we think that if it was rewritten, then we could it could be really useful for cultural heritage as well. But the overall discussion on the number of indicators overall for GGA. So there's been really different ideas around what that would look like. And there has been some concern that cultural heritage wouldn't get many indicators. But now in the last draft text, there was a suggestion on the 100 indicators across the whole GGA. And I don't think that they'll have any, that no target will have 0. So so we're still waiting to hear on the indicator number.
Yeah, thank you. So if I understand, so the member states and observers were invited to inform the subsidiary bodies of any indicators currently in use at any level, local to international, related to cultural heritage and adaptation. And as Johanna said, several hundred poured in. But then the experts reviewed them against some criteria. And Johanna, if I understand correctly, in your first pass, you found that maybe 80 of the submissions, roughly, actually related sort of squarely to cultural heritage, and 80 maybe were sort of properly concerned with adaptation. Do I have that about right?
I need to check the numbers, but we also have kind of hybrid ones as well. So they were specifically adaptation of cultural heritage, or there might be more on cultural heritage where we could add the adaptation component as well.
Yeah, I mean, our suspicion at Haka is that very few indicators are in existence around the world that are actually properly concerned with cultural heritage and also firmly, squarely measuring adaptation. Just to preview our thinking on it, but the experts are sifting through that. Thank you. Last question. And Luckson, let me maybe give you this question and then ask Constantinos to come in if he wants to supplement. And that is, what's happening with the GGA file here at COP29? We don't have a decision text yet. The state parties are arguing, the member states are arguing about it. What are maybe 1 or 2 key issues from your perspective that are live in the negotiations today?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. And I think one, just before I answer that question, there's a key message that from what Johanna was giving, that cultural heritage target received the least amount of indicators. That alone tells you why we are having this problem and why a discussion like this is very important. And that tells you how cultural heritage has been sidelined in adaptation space. So I think it's something that we need to take home, thinking about what does this really mean in terms of the perception of or the amount of literature or the amount of knowledge that we have or that we know about cultural heritage. It's not that there's no extensive information, but it's just that it didn't have quite good space in the adaptation, discourse. But then to back to the question, we have seen a lot of developments in terms of the negotiations on mainly on the guidance that the experts really needed for. I think in the 8 weeks that we engaged on the indicator work, we realized that the conclusions or the guidance that we had received from the SB conclusions from Bonn, it wasn't really enough. And we also realized that most of the guidance in itself was too vague and open to many personal interpretations. So we said, can we have something that is more concrete so that it smoothen the work of the experts? And one of the key issues that are also coming up from the negotiations is at what level should you consider your indicators? And this is what the countries are arguing for. Should we have national indicators that are just going to focus on national level, or should we have global indicators that are going to sort of give an overview picture of where we are if you consider, for example, cultural heritage, what has been the support received across other countries, what sort of adaptation strategies in the cultural heritage sector that are sort of being implemented across countries. And we know that this information is being collected anyway across countries. If you look at your biennial transparency reports, you have many information countries that are reporting on cultural heritage. So the discussion now is, should we have global indicators or should we have national indicators? And there's been a big back and forth between countries, a lot of pushback on if we are to have global indicators, how can you reflect the national or the local perspective of the nature of climate change adaptation? So I think there's going to be some really good text coming out of these negotiations, but it's one of the things that have been discussed. One of the things also that have been very, very difficult to many parties is, should we have indicators that are going to measure the support that has been provided in terms of adaptation, your capacity building, your technology transfer, but more importantly, the funding that has been directed towards adaptation. And we hope that the countries are going to sort of come up with a clear guidance as to whether the experts should consider indicators that are focusing on means of implementation, and also whether this is going to be global indicators, or should this be ending at national indicators. But I think, commenting from an expert point of view, it's important to have both the global indicators that are going to give you an overview of the direction that you're taking towards meeting your GGA targets, because your targets are global. So basically, you need something that is also going to sort of give you an overview. And this is important in terms of raising your ambition. Should you consider raising your ambition based on the outcomes of your indicators? But also, we don't need to lose track by focusing on a global scale. If you look at, for example, a cultural heritage sector, we know that this is very context-specific. Cultural heritage across regions is different. If you look at indigenous knowledge, it's also different. What is indigenous knowledge or what is traditional knowledge in one area is not traditional knowledge in another area. So these are quite context-specific, area-specific, region-specific issues. So it's important also to have indicators that are going to capture these local relevance. So I think that's what has been happening in the negotiations. And we hope that today and tomorrow, the parties are going to sort of come together, have a conclusion on the best interest of having progress on GGA. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Luckson, and we'll have to leave it at that. But I just put to you, let's say you worked at the National Statistics Agency in your country, and you were asked to develop an indicator for measuring progress in your country on adapting your country's cultural practices. What indicator would you write? If you had to draft an indicator that measured progress in guiding infrastructure development with traditional knowledge, what indicator would you write? And that's the task that has been given to these experts. And so it's incredibly important, and we thank them for their work and for their collaboration with the broader heritage community and stakeholders. And thank you for taking time to join us today. So please, a round of applause for Luckson and online for Johanna and Constantinos. Okay, so as the experts work away and the politicians work down the hall, broader stakeholders and constituencies interested in these topics have also organized to intervene and to try to get the best out of these processes. And we want to close today by telling you a little bit about those efforts and how you can get involved. And to kick us off in that conversation, going to ask the technician if he would put the PowerPoint back up. PowerPoint, please. And I'm going to ask to come to the stage my colleague, João Paulo Silva, to lead us off. JP?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure. So after everything we've seen from scientists, from different perspectives, talking about this scenario right now, this historical moment where culture has been included for the first time into the climate policy negotiations. In this scenario, thinking about this amazing opportunity, we developed the Heritage Adapts to Climate Alliance, as we call it, HACA. You all received a little card in your seats that with a QR code that will lead to HACA. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. And what is HACA? So HACA is a platform, a community of practice where other people, rather than just us here, can interact, can exchange information about all that's related to cultural heritage and climate change, thinking about adaptation. And all these discussions that are being led here they already happen inside HACA. So HACA is a platform where you can join us, and please join us whenever you can, where all types of people, of communicators, of professionals, can join us together with the communities, indigenous, traditional, local communities, to discuss all these thematics, all these targets. And so, as you can see in the slide, we develop in this moment trying to scale effective, equitable, and locally led adaptation action, a place to discuss all of this, thinking about heritage sites and cultural practices, guided by the global goal on adaptation. We have a little video to explain a little bit more about what is HACA. And please, may I push again? Oops, sorry.
Our natural and cultural heritage sites represent the best of who we are as a people and a planet. These sites inspire us and hold the key to our species' resilience. But this resilience is under threat.
Climate change is here, and its devastating impacts are only growing stronger.
Instead of counting the terraces, you should ask for like how many families are affected here. So we have like 12 owners affected for just this single slide. And I think we won't be able to restore this until the next cropping. Nothing was harvested from this year, nothing will be harvested from next year. If you want this heritage of humanity, then I think humanity should step in.
This is the flood coming from Wadi al-Jarrah. It's pretty huge. It really makes me sad. I'm born and raised here, so I want to protect this and make it sustainable as long as possible. That's why I want to be part of the solution.
Preserving Legacies is on a mission to empower communities to safeguard their heritage against the impacts of climate change. Through climate literacy, locally led risk assessments, and adaptation actions, Preserving Legacies ensures our heritage endures in a future that demands change. But local action is not enough. Culture and heritage are absent from climate adaptation policy. It's time to connect community solutions to policy decisions. Through the Heritage Adapts to Climate Alliance, Preserving Legacies is leading heritage partners and practitioners to demand that culture get a seat at the table in the global goal on adaptation. Join the Haka Alliance, and together we can create a future for our past.
The PowerPoint continues. So in the last minute, just to tell you, you heard already about the UAE BALEM work program and the current action to try to develop indicators for all the targets, including cultural heritage. This has been also a first focus of Haka. Some hundreds of colleagues have already been collaborating. We actually developed proposed indicators to measure 9G, but also the other dimensions. So we did suggest an indicator for capturing the idea of progress of incorporating ethical engagement with local communities into the whole cycle of adaptation. We proposed an indicator for measuring the extent to which the adaptation is being guided by indigenous knowledge, and we proposed an indicator for measuring the extent to which infrastructure development is being guided by traditional knowledge. What's an example? Well, for example, how much money is your country spending on training infrastructure project managers to be able to take on board traditional knowledge? How much money are they giving to indigenous peoples organizations to allow them to be involved in the co-design of infrastructure projects? These are examples of indicators we proposed. I want to share with you this QR code where you can read details on all the indicators that Haka has proposed so far. But this is really on the early days of the process. There's still a lot to go. And so a second QR code, sorry for the multiplicity of QR codes. This is where you can sign up to be a part of the Haka network and to be engaged actively in contributing the input of culture and heritage advocates into the UAE BALEM work program on indicators, but into the broader process of operationalizing the global goal on adaptation. And the very last thing to say, the aspirations of Haka don't end there. It's not a legal exercise to see if we can get the best policy ever. The goal is to scale culture-based climate action at the ground. So as we start to, fingers crossed, as we start to have success in getting a good outcome on indicators and GGA implementation at a policy level, how do we then help colleagues and leaders at a national level to make sure that that incorporation of cultural heritage at international level is then taken on board at national levels. And by the way, we're already seeing this. Brazil issued their new NDC a few days ago, got a lot of splash. In the adaptation priority section, it basically repeats the GGA thematic priority. So cultural heritage is now a priority in Brazil in their national adaptation strategy, modeling the GGA. So how do we replicate that in every country? But then, maybe most importantly, how do we help local leaders leverage these policy successes to support their efforts? So as culture is more and more present in international and national and even regional adaptation planning and policy, that should give local leaders a stronger claim on adaptation finance. It should give them a seat at the table in adaptation policy making at their municipal and regional levels. So a last ambition of HACA is to complete that circle and make sure that the progress we make in policy levels translates into more support for locally led adaptation on the ground. And with that, we've come to the end of our session of Culture in the Global Glow on Adaptation. Huge thanks to all the speakers who fitted this session in the final hours of the COP, which so much going on, and thank you to the audience for sticking with us. This session was sadly not live streamed, but videotape will be made available on the UNFCCC YouTube page in the coming weeks, and we'll try to share that with you as well. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your COP.